Hello, I am Dr. Wendy Slatkin, an art historian and author of the book Portrait of a Community, Selections from the Chaffee Community Museum of Art, the CCMA. One of the important roles for the museum is to recognize and preserve the works of the most historically significant artists of the Pomona Valley. By nominating an Artist of the Year, the CCMA raises the public's awareness and appreciation of these distinctive creators. In this series of video portraits, sponsored by the CCMA, we are continuing this goal of documenting the careers of their select group of Artists of the Year. Today we are delighted to welcome you into the magical world of Dee Marcellus Cole. I'm standing in front of her amazing Upland studio home. Cole is CCMA's 2016 Artist of the Year. Now nearly 90 years old, she has spent her entire creative life in Upland, California. Her home, tucked into a corner lot, boldly announces her vocation from the street. It is both visible and private. Cole has lived an eventful, creative life, which she recounts in a lively manner in her recently published autobiography titled My Middle Name is Color. This book is available at the CCMA Museum store. Born in Nebraska in 1932, Cole recalls moving 22 times with her parents, who lived in North Dakota, Northern California, and Virginia.
My mother was a very creative person, and I can remember people coming to our house to look at our house because we had a different house. So it's just like I've grown up with it, and it's just part of me. We had creative food, we had creative furniture, and she always made my father suits and my clothing, and that was her creative outlet.
As a teenager, Dee Marcellus sewed many of her own clothes as a creative outlet. In 1953, she married and had 2 girls. The family moved to Upland in 1960, where a 3rd daughter was born. After her divorce, she married photographer and art teacher Jeff Cole. Dee Marcellus Cole was awarded an MA degree in art from the Claremont Graduate School in 1984. She taught at Laverne University for 12 years.
I remarried, and that Jeff was my champion. He saw that I finished my education. He saw that I was talented. And when we moved into this house, we fought over walls because he was a photographer, and we fought and every once in a while he'd say, "Woman, you're taking up more wall space than I am." But because his photography was smaller and I painted big.
As we enter into this artist's space, one can see that every available surface is encrusted with fascinating objects. In addition to a selection of her own works, art by other artists and folk art pieces activate and enliven the spaces. As noted, the title of Cole's autobiography is My Middle Name is Color, and color dominates her aesthetic environment. Walls are painted in the brilliant hues of Central American folk art, which is one of her main sources of inspiration. One of the interesting characteristics of Cole's process is her use of recycled objects. Cole collects a variety of objects that speak to her, such as boots, chairs, and clothing, as well as discarded materials such as old telephone books. This recycling is evident in her home, where she flattened hundreds of bottle caps and nailed them to her kitchen cabinets, creating a constellation of textures and patterns, and transforming the everyday wooden cabinet into something unique and special and dematerialized.
Oh, the world is so junked up, and I think it's important that we recycle And not that I make a statement in any of my pieces about it being recycled, it just seemed practical. And I think that comes from growing up in the Depression and growing up during World War II. We didn't have stuff. I just love traveling in countries where color is so important in their houses and their clothing and their pottery. Everything is color. I can remember returning home from a trip, probably from Mexico, and all the houses were beige. And down the closer you got to the equator, the brighter things were. And it just turns me on. I just think it's more me.
Her works populate her backyard. Here we can see a few of her sculptures, which use pre-made commercial mannequins. In this series of works, the normative proportions of the mannequins function as a sort of canvas, disrupting the organic sense of a unified human body. Her use of mannequins recalls the famous International Exhibition of Surrealism at the Beaux-Arts Gallery in Paris in 1938. 20 artists, including noted surrealists André Masson and Juan Miró, used prefabricated mannequins to line the passageway into the main gallery, which Marcel Duchamp had transformed with hundreds of sacks of coal suspended from the ceiling. Cole's mannequins are transformed by the application of color. The use of non-naturalistic color applied in patterns disrupts the integrity of the limbs, heads, and torsos. In her work, Scattered Raindrops, Cole breaks up the form into blue and brown parts and then tops the work with a grimacing Day of the Dead mask to further distance the figure from the real world.
I'm very inspired for regular folk artists. I've traveled a lot in Central, South America, and Mexico. And there's all these people that make something from nothing. And that really inspires me because they use something, they say, what if? They make beautiful things and they really don't care where they show. They hope to sell, but not necessarily. I call myself a faux folk artist. The materials I use, I find at thrift stores. I love going to thrift stores and finding whatever, and I store them out in my garage. And they sit out there in little boxes, and I go out shopping in my garage, bring this stuff, a pile of stuff in, and I sit there and I go, what if? What if? I love the word what if. I want to go beyond the normal. And so that's a part of the process, gathering materials. And then the sculptures, the big sculptures, have to stand right from the beginning. I can't recorrect it later. It has to be able to stand, and they get built up. And some of them I have to climb ladders for. Very, very labor intensive. And then when it comes time to decide what color, I look up fabric that I've collected, textiles from the different countries, or pottery, and I choose a palette. Otherwise, I get in a color rut. I build a firm basis out of cardboard, out of sticks, out of crutches, out of anything I have, whatever I find. And then it has a surface. Then I take craft paper and I tear it in strips, because cutting, I don't like the having it cut, because when it's cut, you can always see that line, but when you tear it, it kind of blends in. I was sort of in between the movements. I couldn't get a job early on of any kind because my husband was in the Navy. Yes, it's affected me. Of course it has. And I didn't have the drive that some of the women did have. And I had a family, so I did it more. I didn't like to think of myself as a hobbyist, but I did more part-time. I didn't make a living off of it, and never have. I would tell them good. I don't think that that's bad at all. I would teach you how to draw, and like anything else, it's practice, practice, practice. But I want you to know this class would be about learning how to be creative, very creative. And most artists, are very creative, and they don't necessarily need to know how to draw.
The CCMA's example of Cole's over life-size sculpture, Avatar, reveals a number of characteristics of her entire body of work. When not using the prefab mannequins, Cole likes to manipulate and exaggerate the proportions of her figures. They are still somewhat human, but parts are stretched and elongated to create a non-human creature. Many of her large-scale figures have long arms that project into the viewer's space and elongated necks which propel the heads away from the bodies. This style works equally well in relief works such as Headband Dancer or the freestanding sculptures such as Scattered Raindrops and Avatar. Dee Cole has defined herself as a, quote, faux folk artist, unquote, and readily expresses her love and inspiration from Mexico, Central, and South American folk art. It is the artists of Oaxaca, however, whose painted creations and focus on pattern and color seem to be the most direct stimulus for Cole's style. These three works by Oaxacan artists are characteristic of the exuberant patterning of this school of folk artists. Cole's enthusiastic unwillingness to separate art from craft or make the distinction between high art and folk art is consistent with broad trends in the art world first developed in the 1970s. Spurred by women artists who saw themselves as marginalized from the dominant movements of abstract expressionism and minimalism, the pattern and decoration movement, known as P&D, focused on women and previously ignored craft techniques, pulling them from the devalued margins into the center of contemporary art practice. Dee Marcellus Cole is a generous, delightful woman with a warm, outgoing personality. She and her late husband, Jeff Cole, were strong supporters of the art institutions of the Pomona Valley. Jeff Cole was a president of the Chaffee Community Art Association, the CCAA, in the 1970s. Dee served on the Da Gallery's first board of directors in 1984.
I found other painters, and we'd go out and we'd paint on the streets. They didn't have a place to exhibit, so we exhibited in hair salons, banks, libraries, and places like that. And I met Sam Maloof, and he was so generous about fundraising. But I met a lot of nice, lovely people through the Art Association.
In 2016, the Da honored her with its second annual Goddess of Pomona Award. In 2017, Cole organized a show at the Claremont Museum of Art, which included 13 of her works and works by others inspired by the spirit of Carnival. In addition to her show recognizing her as Artist of the Year, her most recent work was exhibited at the CCMA in a show called 89 and Counting, during the summer of 2021. It is with a twinge of regret that we leave the Casa de Arte de Dee, the delightful Dee realm of the goddess of Pomona, and return to the mundane suburban streets of Upland, California. We are privileged to have such a gifted original artist living here in the Pomona Valley. She is just one of the many talented visual artists nurtured by this region in the post-World War II era.